And good afternoon, everyone. This is Mr. Harper, and we're going to continue our discussion on the cardiovascular system with our second lecture. So today I want to talk to you about the heart. I want to talk about the anatomy of the heart, the pieces and parts. So let's jump right in. So the heart has, in mammals, 4 chambers. All mammals, and humans are mammals, have 4-chambered hearts. Other animals like amphibians, they have 3-chambered hearts. But mammals have 4 chambers. On the top, they have a right atrium and a left atrium. Atrium is singular. I could talk about them together, and I'd say the atria, because atria is plural. Now you notice that I'm pointing to the right one, and it looks like it's on the left side. That is the right atrium. As that heart is in your body, when it's laying on the table, you flipped it over, and now you have the right on the left and vice versa, so don't be confused by that. So there are 2 chambers on the top that receive blood. Blood comes into the right atrium, and blood comes into the left atrium, enters the heart from blood vessels. On the bottom are 2 more chambers. You have the right ventricle and the left ventricle, and those 2 chambers pump blood out of the heart. So when the right ventricle pumps, blood goes out this blood vessel, which is the pulmonary artery. When this chamber pumps, the left ventricle, blood goes underneath of that of the right ventricle and comes out the aorta, which is this big blood vessel right here. The chambers are separated by a piece of heart material that is called the septum. And that septum, it doesn't look like it, but it actually comes up between the 2 atria also. So you can see the blood on the left-hand side is blue, and on the right-hand side is blue. The blood on the left-hand side of the heart is red. The red color indicates that this side of the heart carries blood that is high in oxygen, and the right side, the blue side, indicates that this carries blood that is low in oxygen. So there's no mixing of these left and right side because of this septum. And then you have the outside walls of the heart. Remember we talked about there are 3 layers, and this biggest part of this wall is that center layer, the myocardium, the muscles that help the heart pump, not the wall. Now, there are valves in the heart. Valves are connective tissue. There are valves in a couple of places. In the heart itself, they are between the atria and the ventricles. There are also valves between the ventricles and the blood vessels that take blood out of the heart. And valves help to move blood in one direction, as we learned from the video earlier this week. They prevent blood from going backwards because valves are like one-way doors. They can open and let blood go in one direction, but then they close. They do not let blood go the other way because they cannot open in the opposite direction. The valves open as blood is pumped through, and they are held in place by these little cords called chordae tendineae, or sometimes called heartstrings. They prevent that backflow. So let's talk about these valves. There are atrioventricular valves. Now, atrio, you hear the word atrium in there, and ventricular, you hear the word ventricle. Atrioventricular valves are between the atria and the ventricles. There's one on the left side called a bicuspid valve, and you also hear that be called a mitral valve. There's one on the right side called the tricuspid valve. And then there are semilunar valves. These valves are called semilunar, and they're separated from the other 2 valves because these valves have different shapes. So they're named actually by their shape. But these 2 valves are between the ventricles and the arteries. On the right side, you have a pulmonary valve that is between the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery. On the left side, you have an aortic valve that's between the left ventricle and the aorta. So let me show you where those are in a picture. So here's your right atrium, here's your right ventricle, and right here is the tricuspid valve. These little cords here, these are called chordae tendineae, and we'll call this whole thing the valve. And then on the left side, you have the left atrium and the left ventricle, and you have a valve between it called the bicuspid valve. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as the mitral valve. So when the right atrium pumps, the tricuspid valve opens, lets blood into the right ventricle, and then it shuts so that the blood can't go backwards. When the left ventricle contracts, the bicuspid or mitral valve opens, lets blood into the left ventricle, and then it shuts so that when the left ventricle pumps, blood can't go back up into the left atrium. When the right ventricle contracts or pumps, blood is forced through this pulmonary semilunar valve, which we're just going to call the pulmonary valve, into the pulmonary artery, and it splits in two here. The pulmonary artery is going to carry blood to the lungs. This one's going to the left lung, and this one's going to the right lung. And then this valve shuts so that blood cannot flow back down into the right ventricle. When the left ventricle contracts, blood is forced through the aortic valve into the aorta, and then it shuts so blood can't go back down into the left ventricle. Now, when the heart is actually in operation, the two atria, left and right, contract together. The tricuspid valve and the bicuspid valve open together, and blood fills into the right ventricle and the left ventricle at the same time. And then both ventricles contract together. Blood is forced out into the pulmonary artery and out into the aorta artery. We don't really call it the aorta artery, we just call it the aorta. But it is an aorta artery at the exact same time. Your heart has two beats. Your heart goes ba-boom, ba-boom, ba-boom. That ba is the two atria contracting, and then the boom is the two ventricles contracting. The ventricles have more muscle. You can see how thick the muscle wall is here. The muscles of the atrium are a lot thinner up here. So the boom is the ventricles contracting, because when the atria contract, they only have to push blood down into the ventricles. Blood doesn't have to go very far. So their muscles are pretty weak in comparison. When the ventricles contract, blood is forced out of the heart. And so those ventricles have to be much stronger. So you have a boom, bigger contraction on that second part. And that's the heartbeat. Major blood vessels. First you have the aorta. Blood leaves the left ventricle and goes out to all the parts of the body through the aorta, high in oxygen. That left side has red blood that's high in oxygen. Pulmonary arteries. Pulmonary arteries right here. It's one artery, but then it splits into two pieces. Pulmonary artery to one lung, pulmonary artery to the other. Oxygen poor blood leaves the right ventricle heading to the lungs. And it's oxygen poor on this right side. It's heading to the lungs because in the lungs is where it's going to get oxygen. The vena cava. There's an inferior vena cava that brings blood from the lower part of the body. Remember, inferior means below. There's a superior vena cava that brings blood from the upper part of the body. Remember, superior means above. Both of these bring blood into the right atrium. It's low in oxygen because this blood is coming from the body, and the cells of the body have taken the oxygen out of the blood, so now it's low in oxygen. So blood comes in this right atrium, goes to the right ventricle, pumped out through the pulmonary artery to go to the arteries when it splits in two, and then goes to the lungs to pick up oxygen. Now the pulmonary veins, there are four of them here and here. You can see right here, these are dumping into the left atrium, and here these two are cutting behind the heart, and they're going to dump also into this left atrium. The pulmonary veins are bringing blood rich in oxygen because they're coming from the lungs, and they're going to fill this left atrium, then pump to the left ventricle, and then pump out the aorta high in oxygen to go to all the cells of the body. Now, let me say one more thing here. The definition of a vein is a blood vessel that brings blood to the heart. So you're seeing that these four are all pointing into the heart. The superior vena cava vein into the heart, the inferior vena cava vein into the heart. So these are all veins because they're carrying blood to the heart. Arteries, the pulmonary artery here, and the aorta are all carrying blood away from the heart, and that's the definition of an artery. So, we've talked about the major chambers of the heart, four of them. We've talked about the septum that separates the heart, the walls of the heart, the myocardium is the heavy muscle part. We've talked about the major valves that close to prevent blood from going back. We've talked about the major veins that bring blood into the heart, and the major arteries that carry it out of the heart. We'll talk more about the parts of the heart and how this all works in future discussions. So for now, we are done, and we'll talk next time.